Hello world, thank you for watching video 6 of our pyramid series. We do find it important to note that over the last month or so of us preparing for this video, we realized we were not completely correct in describing this drought. So before we get into this, we need to go over what we discovered.
This is something that could help Egyptologists make sense of the timeline of ancient Egypt. Archaeologists describe a 200-year time span close to the time of the pyramid where there was no Aket season. This was a massive drought that is thought to have collapsed the Old Kingdom. We were originally going to tie the drought into this video about the Exodus, but we realized that was in error. What we realized is that this drought was caused by their system.
When their system functioned like we described in our previous video, they essentially rerouted a substantial amount of water during the Aket season underground and into Lake Moeris. This means that the entire Nile, from Aswan to the Mediterranean, would not have experienced any flooding during the Aket season, or at the very least, there was a noticeable reduction in water volume.
What we do describe in this video, however, is a logical explanation to a major anomaly in ancient Egypt, the reason Lake Moeris turned to salt water. Up until now, nobody knows why this happened or when, but we not only know how, but also have a logical timeline of when this happened. There are a few other things we need to go over before we continue with our explanation. In our previous video, we mentioned that they dug a drain pipe ending close to the Mediterranean so they could get into their system to renovate it. They ensured this pipe ended above sea level so that no salt water could get into their system.
What we didn't mention is that these renovations were not an overnight fix. They probably took several years, if not more. That means that for several years during every Aket season, water from Aswan flowed through this pipeline straight into the Mediterranean. This would have actually carved a channel between the pipeline and the sea. After they finished building and renovating everything, they plugged this pipeline with a block. But remember, they didn't have ways to create watertight seals, so the system still would have had a constant leak year-round. This leak would have started small, but slowly eroded away at the limestone, increasing its size every year. The water from this leak would have continued carving the channel deeper and deeper as well.
There would finally come a point when this channel had been carved down to sea level and the water leaking out eroded a hole large enough for all hell to break loose. At this point, their system still would appear to function as normal. During the Aket season, most of the water would flow out of the Osiris chambers onto the Giza Plateau like normal. However, some of the water would drain out of this pipeline into the Mediterranean, causing a loss in water pressure. This wouldn't cause a catastrophe just yet, but this time when the Aket season ended, the real problem would have begun.
All the water in the system that was above sea level would drain out into the Mediterranean until the water in the pipeline balanced out with sea level. After this happened, the salt water of the Mediterranean would have slowly begun working its way into the pipeline and forcing all fresh water out of the pipeline.
If you know anything about what happens when salt and fresh water meet, you'll know the two types of water initially remain separate, and salt water sinks to the bottom because it's heavier. So the salt water would have worked its way into the bottom of the pipeline first, then slowly overtook the entire system.
But at this point, the Egyptians wouldn't have known anything was wrong. They weren't using this pipeline anyway, so a major malfunction never would have even crossed their minds. They would have just been using Lake Moeris like every other year. However, this time when the Aket season began, here's what would have happened. At the beginning of the Aket season, the 450 miles of salt water would have been forced through this pipeline, being pushed by the fresh water in Aswan.
Some of it would have run back to the Mediterranean, but most of this salt water would have flowed out of the Osiris shafts like normal, down the causeway and back into the Lake Moeris. It probably took a few days for the fresh water to finish purging out all of the salt water from their system. But because it eventually went back to normal, they didn't worry too much about it.
At this point, they essentially just pumped 400 miles of salt water into Lake Moeris. However, only the bottom of the lake would have been salt water. The top of the lake would still be fresh water. Because of this, after the Aket season ended and they switched the system over to receive water and fish from Moeris, only fresh water would have flown out. This process would have continued for multiple years. They continued pumping salt water into Lake Moeris and draining fresh water out of it, which would raise the lake's salinity levels.
Now we speculate this initially would have actually given them an increase in the amount of fish coming out of the lake, because as more and more salt water filled the bottom of the lake, the area freshwater fish could have lived in would actually have decreased, forcing all the fish to hang out closer to the inlet of the piping system. Because of this, the Egyptians would not have been worried. This strange occurrence would have actually benefited them. Now, eventually, the salt water in the lake would mix with the fresh water, turning the entire lake into salt water. Not the same salinity levels as the Mediterranean, but definitely saltier than the Nile.
If you remember, we mentioned in a previous video that the Osiris chambers still have water in them today, described as being saltier than the Nile, but not quite as salty as the Mediterranean. This is the same description as the water in Lake Karun, which is the smaller lake in the Fayum region where Lake Moeris used to be. We'll post a link in the description below to the water test if you don't believe us. This only further corroborates our theory. We want you to realize we are not making anything up or giving the Egyptians any crazy technology. Everything we've described is already found and described by Egyptologists, but for some reason, they can't figure out how to link it all together. They're too focused on the constellations.
Anyway, here's where things get interesting. Because the lake was now saltwater, it would have had only dead, rotting fish in it. So this time, when they allowed water to flow out of the lake, salt water would run down the Nile for 8 months, soaking into the land, killing all the crops and life in the Nile below Giza, destroying the delta for years to come. People and livestock would not be able to drink the water, and the fish would have been too rotten to eat.
What is interesting is that there are multiple cities that all packed up and left overnight without premeditation, and Egyptologists don't know why. These cities were all downriver of Lake Moeris. With our theory, it makes sense that many people would leave and move somewhere else, causing a mass exodus.
Now we want to touch on an interesting concept we've been looking into regarding this. It will take the collaboration of many scholars, but we think there is a strong correlation between our theory and biblical history. In our previous video, we said, don't get this Exodus confused with the story of Moses. However, after further research, we do see a strong correlation. Please remember, we have not come up with this theory in an attempt to prove the Bible. Over the last 10 or so years, we have been making videos and we haven't once mentioned anything about the Bible. So this is too coincidental to ignore.
When the lake turned to salt water, it would have been filled with dead fish and bloody water. And when this water flowed out of their system, it probably would have caused many things to happen. Now, we aren't scientists, so we don't know the exact order of events. But here is the way we see it playing out. The first thing that would have happened is the Nile turning to blood, just like the first plague. Then this water, which was filled with dead rotting fish, would create a series of insect infestations. This would then kill all livestock and start infecting people with diseases, until the people with the weakest immune systems would have died, which would have been the young children.
The reason it's going to take a team of experts to figure this out is because the ancient Egyptian timeline and the biblical timelines do not line up, but we believe this is something worth looking into. There has also been an ancient document found called the Ipuwer Papyrus that is now in the Leiden Museum in Holland. This papyrus describes the exact same chain of events in history as Moses. However, Egyptologists will not connect these two stories for two reasons. First, the ancient Egyptian timeline doesn't line up with it. And second, up until now, there has been no corroborating evidence to support such an event taking place. They say the plagues would have been impossible to have happened. We strongly believe that there is it is time for major correction in the timeline because it is too coincidental for them not to have discovered this.
The only other time the Bible describes a catastrophe in ancient Egypt is with Joseph. His story described a 7-year increase followed by a 7-year famine so severe the increase would not be remembered. We believe his famine was also caused by this system, but still don't know exactly how. We speculate it might be close to the time the Sphinx's head was blown off, or it might be later, closer to the time of Amenemhet III.
Interestingly enough, we found out there is a channel leading from the Nile to Lake Moeris called the Joseph's Channel, which supports the idea he was involved with this system. If you would like to hear our theory as to how Joseph's famine ties into the system, please let us know, and we will be happy to make another video about this.
Thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned for our next video where we clarify any confusion we may have caused from lack of description, reveal why Caliph al-Mamun couldn't find the swivel door, and finally, for the first time in history, discuss what we believe was buried in the sarcophagus of the king's chamber.
Thank you.